Good morning, everyone. First of all, I apologize for this little delay to go live because we were facing a bit of a technical glitch, as is the normal in the new normal, and we keep saying that. So good morning, everyone. Well, this morning we are to listen to Professor Ernest Emenyonu, who is a giant in the field of African American studies and African American literary and cultural studies. There is a slight bad news that Professor Ernest Emenyonu is not joining us live because he has suddenly faced a medical emergency. He had to go for an eye operation. So therefore, just a few days back, he had informed us. And I'm very, very thankful to Dr. Kalapi Sen, who is also joining us in this session. She took all the trouble of contacting him and getting the things done. So the good news is that Professor Emenyonu has sent us a video, and that video, the video of his lecture, will be played right now, and we are all going to listen to him. So first of all, a big, big thank you to Professor Kalapi Sen, and a very big thank you to the IQAC team as always, and a very special thanks, I must say, to Professor Debanjan, because he has saved the day for us. These technical glitches are something that keep happening, and there are saviors. These are the new saviors of this world. So we have the IQAC team as the savior throughout. They are still the savior, but we have a new savior this day, which is Professor Debanjan. So thank you, Debanjan, and I also welcome Dr. Chandrani Biswas, who is also joining us in this meet. So now I would request Professor Debanjan to kindly proceed with the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Nilanjanda. And thank you everyone for giving me this opportunity. And frankly, I'm honored to introduce such a world-renowned critic like Professor Emenyonu. Professor Ernest Emenyonu is Professor Emeritus of African Studies at the University of Michigan. He was appointed editor of African Literature Today in 2000 and has edited more than 14 volumes since 2002. One of the preeminent scholars in the world of African literature, Professor Emenyonu has published extensively in the field of African literature, including the literary history of the Igbo novel, African Literature in African Languages, published in 2020. Remembering a Legend, Chinua Achebe, 2014, Uzoeshi, A Story of African Childhood, 2012, that's a fairy tale, and Emerging Perspectives on Nawal El Sadawi, and also Emerging Perspectives on Chinua Achebe, Volume 1 and 2, published in 2004. Now, the achievements of a scholar of his status is definitely cannot be enlisted here properly, but I think this would do for the time being. And we again deeply regret that he couldn't be here with us, but he has been kind enough to record a video lecture specifically for us, specifically for this occasion. And I would like to play that video. So now we can listen to him.
Debanjan, please carry on, yes.
Just a minute.
Greetings to all the participants in this seminar from India, from Nigeria, from the United States, and elsewhere in the world. My name is Ernest Emenyonu. I wish first of all to thank the organizers of this seminar, specifically Dr. Nilanjan, who invited me to give the keynote address. He informed me that the seminar theme is of centers and margins, origin, conflicts, and issues. And he wanted me to speak on this in relation to African literature and aesthetics. I started working on a paper along that line But shortly after, something happened and I changed the topic that I had been working on. I am also the editor of African Literature Today. This is an annual volume which started as a journal in 1968 in UK. In 2019, in 2019, we were at African Literature number 37, celebrating the 50th anniversary of what started as a journal in England, a Journal of African Literature, but today it's an annual volume. We alternate annual volumes, and we alternate themed volumes with non-themed volumes. For instance, 2019, the theme was, the theme was a celebration of the 50th anniversary. 2020, the theme was environmental transformations in African literature. For 2021, the theme is science fiction, science and speculative fiction. Then we decided that for number 40, we will do a non-themed volume, which means that we have a general, we have an open invitation for scholars to submit articles on any aspect of African literature, any writer, any theme of their choice. If it's good and their assessors recommend that we publish them, they will be in a non-themed volume. But we always would give a title for the non-themed volumes. So for LC 40, we chose the title African Literature Comes of Age. And we sent out a call for papers for scholars to submit articles accordingly, non-themed, just something excellent, any perspective of African literature, whether in comparison to Indian literature, in comparison with with British literature, in comparison with Caribbean literature, and so on and so forth. But we picked the title African Literature Comes of Age. Shortly after we had circulated the call for papers, I received a very brief email from a scholar, 3-line email asking me, does literature grow and come of age? Or is it always born already fully grown? Does literature grow and come of age? Or is it always born already fully grown? I had to stop where I was, I had to change the topic I was working on. Instead of talking about African literature and aesthetics in relation to of centers and margins, origins, conflicts, and issues, I decided to go back and talk about African literature and history, and to deal with the question that had been asked: does literature grow and come of age, or is it always born already fully grown? I decided to speak on this because it gives us an opportunity to make some clarifications which perhaps have affected African literature, perceptions of African literature in various parts of the world. There are two, we can talk about a claimed origin of African literature and a genuine, authentic origin of African literature. The claimed origin can be described as one of those acts of Europe in its imperial expansionism. The early Europeans who came to Africa described Africa as dark, a people in darkness, a continent that's in darkness. And so they wrote about the darkness of Africa, its people, its cultures, if at all they had cultures. And of course, they didn't have literature, according to this claimed origin of African literature. This claimed origin says that African literature was merely an appendage to whatever European language in which it was expressed, because they came with the axiom that if it's not written, it's not literature. And when they came to Africa, they came with that notion that if anything is not written, you cannot call it African literature. I mean, you cannot call it literature. If it's not written, it's not literature. This is in contrast to the African origin of the origins of African literature. Because African literature originated in an oral form. Let me describe it in this way. Think about a tree that's grown, a tree that's planted a seed and then it germinates and it grows, and then it grows into a big tree. The roots inside the soil constitutes the foundation of the tree. That's what holds a tree. If you're building a house, you start with a foundation. The foundation of African literature is that root inside the soil. In literary terms, it's called oral literature. You can see immediately that when we attribute African literature to originating from oral sources, it comes in it comes in complete opposite, complete conflict of the Western concept of literature, that if it's not written, it's not literature. But to go further, African literature has its roots in oral performances, and as time goes on, I will talk a little bit more about the ramifications of these oral performances. And then the stem, the roots hold the stem, and the stem holds the branches. In the African situation, the stem constitutes written literature in indigenous African languages. And the branches, the stem holds the branches, those branches in the African literature situation, those branches are literature in European and non-African languages. So the early Europeans who came, the Western world who saw African literature from the branches, claimed that whatever came out from Africa by way of literature, it has to have been written in a European language. And therefore, appropriately, it should be an appendage to that European literature. In other words, African literature in English is merely an appendage to British literature. African literature in French is merely an appendage to French literature. This is a wide gap, and this is an area of conflict. And the Western scholars who were not aware of oral literature or did not want to be aware of African oral literature dismissed that as non-literature. And because also they were not familiar with indigenous African languages, or they just didn't want to be seen as being familiar with them, they also ignored literature in indigenous African languages and then focused only on branches, the literature written, literature one first written, and then secondly in a European language. And that's really when they began to talk about African literature, in fact, in the middle of the 20th century, when a striking novel, Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, came as a surprise to the world. How do you describe it? How do you classify it? Is it African literature? They said no, because it's written in the English language. And then they say, isn't a literature defined by its language, by the language in which it is expressed, meaning by the language in which it is written? So an understanding of the origin of African literature has to disregard those false ideas about literature. If it's not written, it's not literature. African literary scholars say African literature started as something oral. It wasn't written, but that doesn't make it any less literature. So it's taken some time for these ideas to develop, not among Africans, but because the Africans know that there is something about African oral literature that you cannot dismiss. So I would like to, the challenge has been to African scholars to show what is literary about these oral performances. As I said, oral literature is in various forms: drama, folklore, myths, riddles, and so on and so forth. The most popular form is what's called folk tale, folklore, folk tale. What is folk tale? What's folklore? Folk tale is, folk tales are rich and authentic sources of raw African values in traditional African societies. In past times, they were used for purposes of acculturation and were therefore necessarily didactic and morality laden. Children generally grew up under the tutelage of their mothers, who at chosen times during the formative years told them folk tales in which enshrined community values explicitly. Such occasions served as pastimes and to sustain the interest and curiosity of the children. The storyteller, the raconteur, as he was called, or the oral artist as known in Africa, must make the story real and entertaining, and the experience worthwhile. So we are talking about storytelling, because literature really, in the final analysis, literature is storytelling. The novel is a story told, poem is a story told, drama is a play, it's a story told, except that in the African situation, the stories are told oral. The mother who tells the story embellishes tales, friends, mimic voices of animals, birds, and ghosts, perform improvise, add humor, induce audience participation, and vary her narrative devices and methods constantly for maximum effects. Some of the values have the narrator often using it story advocated instant justice through revenge or the deployment of supernatural forces who would kill off other criminals. In these folktales, good must invariably prevail over it, right? Wit and cunning, the ability to outwit your opponent, the use of common sense, must excel over brute force and abusive might. Hard work must yield good results and be rewarded. Honesty always falsehood and fraud were antisocial behavior and must never escape punishment. Corruption is and as the saying goes, the soul that sinned died instantly, serve as a deterrent to others. In the folktale tradition, everything was oral. And these esteemed values of the community were passed on from one generation to another by word of mouth. Today, the telling of folktales, whereby mothers or uncles or brothers other religions, assembled the children and those during their tender ages, assembled them and told them these stories. And the idea was to entertain and also get them to imbibe some moral. And often these folk tales were told in the evenings after the day's work, possibly and all, especially moonlit evenings. Today, those things are no longer there. Today, children have their values from peers. There are other forms of entertainment, um, the television, the radio, and so on and so forth. But that does not mean that the folktale, the folktale has disappeared completely in Africa, in African societies. African writers, modern African writers, have seen that as a kind of challenge to take the folktale, to take the tradition, and reinvent it and make it fit the times. So writers like Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and so on and so forth, now tackle the task, the responsibility of trying to move the folktale tradition to modern times. Chinua Achebe did his own by taking some folktales and recreating them so that the values that they espouse would be in keeping with the modern times. But back to where this is all coming from. The early Europeans who came to Africa took some time before they realized that there was this form of entertainment, in a form of, it was events that were used, things that were used to in the upbringing of children. And that they were also big sources of community and societal values. The early Europeans, when they came, missionaries in particular who brought Western education, bought into the use of these folk tales. And what they did was to take some folk tales, use their form, their structure, their manner of narration, but substituted the values that they espoused before and substituted them with Christian didacticism. There are several examples of this. For instance, a folk tale that talked about fishing in a particular African culture. The missionaries would then formulate stories about fishing, but anchoring them on what's in the scriptures. Do you know the names of 4 disciples that Jesus called? They were fishermen. They're Peter, Andrew, James, and John. And Jesus asked them to follow him. They will be fishers of men. Some other stories completely changed. And so they actually realized the educative value of the oral performances and decided to exploit that. That's for oral performance. would indicate that that is the foundation of African literature. Whether it's written in English, whether it's written in French, whether it's written in indigenous African languages. It was the early Europeans were ignorant of this, but they utilized it in the process of their job of evangelism. The same, which I had mentioned earlier before, constituted stories written in African languages. There's always nothing had existed in this language. It's a terrible one. Yes. That to this is completely false. In his excellent work, English literature, in his excellent work, titled African Language One, points out that creative work in African languages tested European presence in Africa, and therefore the introduction of the novel. Haridas goes on to say, producing works in African languages long before the and German language. Creative languages were largely inspired by the early European missionary education at the start of the 20th century. But as I pointed out earlier, this took the development in the purposes of evangelism. But and these but there were also writings in these languages in the form of stories, in the form of novels. There are three examples one can use to authenticate this point. South Africa, there was Kaka Zulu, written in Lesotho language. In Nigeria, we have another poem written by Nandi. And also again from Nigeria, we have a Yoruba writer, who had published also the first Yoruba novel in the Yoruba language in 1938. These were novels in African languages, just a few, taking three of them, for example. These that were in African languages before anything, before any novel that was written in English, any African novel that was written in English. For instance, let me speak from the language I know best in Nigeria. That's the Igbo language. Omenoko, that's the first novel published in Igbo language, published in London in 1933. Omenoko was published in 1933, 25 years before things fall apart. I have translated that into English, published in 2014. The Fagoa novel, Obujiode, published in 1938, was translated into English by Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka in 1968. The novel, the novel in Yoruba was published first. It was published in 1938. And then the one I mentioned about South Africa, Shaka, was published in 1931. Shaka Zulu, and has been translated into English by Dan Kunene in 1981. So these three novels, for instance, had existed for more than, for decades before the African writings in English or French. So anybody teaching African literature in any part of the world must give the students a sense of history. Literary histories are important. It is that the ignorance or deliberate ignorance of the Europeans who came to Africa and the 18th and 19th centuries, their deliberate ignorance of what existed that was African, or they chose to ignore that and push their Eurocentric views and values and ideas. If they had recognized the relationship between the oral literature and the literature written in African languages and the literature in modern African, modern African literature in European languages, if they had recognized that there was this continuity from the oral performance to literature written in indigenous African languages, now to literature written in European languages. If they had recognized this, they would not have said that if it's not written, it's not literature. And they would not have tried to, as they did, falsely claim that African literature in English or French is merely an appendage to British or French literature. So anybody teaching African literature has to give it its authentic development trend. The late Isidore Obewo wrote a novel titled Call Me by My Rightful Name. If you call African literature by its rightful name, you would not make the mistake of believing the early Western scholars, critics, Europeans, who said that African literature, African fiction, African novel was simply a novel written by Europeans who were in Africa. That is why in many cases in the Western world, they started talking, African literature to them was the reading of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, or or Joyce Carey's Mr. Johnson, because they were only looking at what Africans wrote in European languages. So we have to give South African literature from its real beginnings. The origin of African literature is oral performance. Wherever you're teaching African literature anywhere in the world today, it will not be a problem. You know, it's no longer, you can no longer say, how do we access oral performances? We don't speak the languages, we don't say, no. There are literatures in German, there are literatures in French, there are literatures in Portuguese. Non-speakers of these languages recognize that these literatures have their foundations. There are German literature, novels, French novels, Portuguese novels. In the same way, African literature comes in many languages. Yes, in England, you would say English is the language. But you're talking about a country. And Africa has 55, if not more, countries that speak hundreds and thousands of languages. Nigeria, for instance, speaks 398, almost 400 languages. And many of these, some of these languages have produced written literatures. I've mentioned Gerard, who, you know, Gerard, who has written about African language literatures. And he said that there are over 50 languages in Africa where creativity has flourished in indigenous languages. You cannot dismiss oral literature, you cannot dismiss literature in indigenous languages and simply start talking about African literature in terms of the literature written in European languages. So that is that's one fundamental fact that we have to establish. You cannot teach African literature as beginning from the middle of the 20th century, because literature storytelling has been on the continent of Africa for as long as this human existence on the continent. That's one major thing. And then the second thing is, again, how the Europeans, how Western scholars, how Western literary scholars have approached literature, African literature in European languages. We cannot cite enough Chinua Achebe's writings, because he was a writer, a creative genius who actually gave African literature, African novel, the African novel. I mean, his first novel, Things Fall Apart, had elsewhere said that Things Fall Apart happened and world literature changed forever. What Chinua Achebe did has never been done before. What he did was a kind of amalgamation of the oral and the written, the traditional and the modern, in narrating the African story. One cannot emphasize enough that non-Western cultures, India, and other places should really take serious what African writers have produced. One, the kind of conflicts that they have reflected in their writings. Readers in these non-Western cultures are likely to identify with them more than they would identify with the themes and narrative techniques of novels or writings or literature in the Western world. When Chinua Achebe published Things Fall Apart, he did that with a sense of mission. He showed that Africa had an art of the novel that was different from the European art of the novel. But that does not mean that it was not legitimate. Achebe did a kind of fusion of the oral and the written. He brought into the art of the novel some of the things that had not been there before. How do you incorporate a folk tale in a novel? How do you incorporate proverbs in a novel? How do you incorporate riddles in a novel? In a novel written in English. There is a mistake made in terms of who are using English language, how and where in the world today. Because speakers of English as a second language or foreign language clearly now outnumber the native speakers of English. But in terms of creativity, African writers have done something marvelous with the English language. And Chinua Achebe started this modern art of the novel in Africa. What he did was to write in English. It shouldn't surprise anybody. In many African countries, many African societies, children begin to learn and be taught in English, even from the kindergarten. So to imagine that Africans cannot write well in English, or writers in Nigeria, for instance, Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, that they cannot write well in English because they are not native speakers. That's really ignoring the facts. So Chinua Achebe, in writing Things Fall Apart, showed for the first time that you can write about Africa using African background, using an African environment, and using English in a way that gives English a new meaning. Chinua Achebe said he extended the frontiers of the English language to accommodate its African surroundings. That is new. He wasn't toying with the English language. He was using English language creatively. Using the English language to describe the African worldview. Europeans who said, the Western scholars who said, a literature is defined by its language. Chinua Achebe immediately said, by language he means a people's worldview. So you go to things fall apart. Look at the way Chinua Achebe described the Igbo worldview. But the bigger picture is that Chinua Achebe was responding to colonization in Africa, applicable also to other places in the world. So things fall apart, as I said, was the beginning. And Chinua Achebe said African writers should actually, use English in this creative way, as long as it's still intelligible, universalistic. So that is one thing about Chinua Achebe, his creative use of the English language. In fact, he used one of his novels, The Arrow of God, to show how you can creatively use English, imaginatively use English, and it will be more appealing than just the plain use of the English language. But there's something else that Chinua Achebe did, which should be taken seriously. He's been the only writer, to the best of my knowledge, who set his works to correspond with the history of the times. They say art is a reflection of reality. What Chinua Achebe has done is to show us how history and literature dovetail into each other. So, with Things Fall Apart, he showed the pre-colonial Africa. And he said that is the way it should be. An African writer necessarily has to show something of the African past. Africa didn't begin to exist from the time the Europeans came to Africa. No, there has been life in Africa. Who built the pyramids? Some people deliberately do not want to recognize Africa at its best. The late Nawal El-Saadawi talked about an experience she had in New York in the early 60s. She was a medical student at Columbia University. And there was a conference on African literature, which she attended. When she introduced herself as coming from Egypt, one of the participants looked at her. One of the participants, obviously a professor, looked at her and said, almost sarcastically, almost condescendingly, "Ready, please, is Egypt in Africa? In other words, what are you doing here?" Now, what El-Saadawi was not the only person who had experienced this kind of thing. Look at some museums there in the world. At least I know one very famous museum in the United States that puts African art in one section, and then far, far away puts Egyptian art and artifacts. I remember confronting the curator about this, and they said, "Oh no, it's correct. That's the way it is. You have Egyptian art, then you have African art." And this is in the 21st century. So, African writers are authentic in their use of English, but they have also done something beyond the use of English in the ordinary sense of the word, of the expression. African writers are writing about Africa, African worldviews, African experiences. Europeans who came to Africa wrote about their experiences in Africa. They wrote about Africa from their European perspectives. So we must clearly understand the difference. But what has, hindered a correct appreciation of African writing is that these early Europeans, when they came with biases and attitudes. You come to Africa and you say it's a dark continent. Therefore, everything you see there is dark. You come to Africa and you say there's no, they have no religion. Therefore, everything that you see there is not religious. It's not religion. It's only religion if it is Christianity. So anybody teaching African literature, or learning African literature, studying African literature has to have a change of perception. If you embrace the European bias and attitudes, you will be making the same mistakes. If, for instance, somebody in India, somebody in a non-Western culture buys into the fact that African literature is only authentic as far, so far as it follows the European model, then that person has bought into a bias. Wherever colonialist expansionism happened, it left its traces. And I believe that people, readers, students, teachers, have to see African literature from a different perspective that does not have the biases that has clouded the visions of people, the reasoning faculties of people, our readers, who tend to say African literature would come only as a subsidiary in the Committee of World Literatures. So as I said, Chinua Achebe did something that no African writer have done. He positioned each of his novels chronologically is related to the history of that particular era. Things fall apart. Pre-colonial. Arrow of God, colonial. Things fall apart ended just as the British were coming into Africa, into Nigeria, into Igbo land. But they came with those biases. And Chinua Achebe had to look them in the face and say, you don't understand us. And you cannot write about us the way we know ourselves. Remember that passage in Things Fall Apart where it said, does the white man understand our custom about land? How can he when he does not even speak our tongue? But he says that customs are bad. And our own brothers who have taken up religion also say that our customs are bad. The white man is very clever. He came quietly and peaceably with his religion. We amused at his foolishness and allowed him to stay. Now he has won our brothers, and our clan can no longer act like one. He has put a knife on the things that held us together, and we have fallen apart. Take that passage, go to any country, any place on earth colonized by a European power. It is true. And this is why people can relate to Africa, to things like that the world over. At the last count, by 2010, I think it was a study by the late Emmanuel Odechina, had identified that things like that had been translated into 65 world languages. Non-Western cultures can relate to the conflicts, to the issues that things like that was all about. Then, so things like that was pre-colonial. And then followed by, in publications, followed by no longer at age. But in chronological sequence, it really is followed by Arrow of God. Arrow of God was a period that there was some kind of attempt for coexistence between the Western and African cultures and values. It didn't work out. No longer at age is colonial period leading up to independence. Chinua Achebe writes about the history of every era. So things like that no longer at age, era of God. Then independence, pre-independence era. And then independence era. A man of the people. But he didn't stop there. He had predicted that, in the end of A Man of the People, that there might be military takeover, a coup. And so in his next novel, Antis of the Savannah, Chinua Achebe writes about the environment of military dictatorship in Africa, in Nigeria in particular. He even wrote a collection of short stories, Girls at War and Other Stories, to reflect what happened during the Nigerian Civil War. But then, Antis of the Savannah showed the military dictatorship. Even before he died, 7 months before he died, Chinua Achebe published There Was a Country, again showing what Nigeria is now, as different from what it was before. Chinua Achebe is the only African writer, to the best of my knowledge, who writes in this chronological sequence, describing in his fiction the realities of the era in historical perspective. So, in summary, before I go to the next aspect of my presentation, in summary, I would advise, in India, for instance, please, when you are teaching your students at all levels, make them clearly aware of the existence of literature in Africa before the coming of the Europeans. Make them clearly aware of the existence of oral literature. In fact, one seminal book on oral literature was Ruth Finnegan's Oral Literature in Africa, published in 1970. Great book. But what had happened is that, in fact, it was the first time that somebody was bringing to the attention of the Western world the existence of oral literature as authentic literature. However, Ruth Finnegan had, in this excellent book, had indicated that certain things, they had omitted the existence of some aspects of oral literature. He said they didn't exist, the epic. So, Isidore Bewo, the late Isidore Bewo, did not call her names. Everybody, many African scholars recognize the critical importance of Ruth Finnegan's oral literature in Africa. So what Isidore did was, for decades, he studied oral literature extensively, seriously in Africa. And by the time he died a few years ago, he had become the world's leading authority on African oral literature. But Ruth Finnegan took it in good strides. And in 2010, she brought out a book. In 2018, she brought out a new book called, and listen to this, Time for the World to Learn from Africa. Time for the world to learn from Africa. This book is a must read for everyone, by everyone who wants to be up to date in terms of African oral literature. So it's a great book. Read side by side with the oral literature in Africa. You have the materials you need. More and more books are coming out in these areas. And of course, Isidore Bewo left a lot of, a lot of works in the area of oral literature. So teachers else, in the Western world and non-Western cultures of the world, please, in your schools, teach African literature and show the significance, show the relationships, show the evolution of African literature from oral performance to writings in indigenous languages to the flowering in European languages. Now let me spend the rest of the time he left talk about collaboration between Nigeria and India, or in fact, collaboration between India and African countries, Indian scholars and African scholars, but particularly now I'm using Nigerian system. Collaboration in sharing their literatures. I would ask, how much literature is taught? How much of African literature, is taught in India, and specifically in what seminar taking place? How much literature? As I said earlier, that I cannot stop emphasizing this. you have to teach African literature as a separate and autonomous subject in the school curriculum. I have had expressions like new literatures in English. If this is the framework in which you teach African literature, you are doing the wrong thing. You are doing a disservice to African literature. You're also doing a disservice to your students. Because African, you cannot classify African literature as new literatures in English. African literature, teach African literature as a separate and autonomous subject. So how is African? Are there universities, are there colleges, institutions of learning or colleges where African literature is taught as a separate, as African literature, and not just woven into an umbrella called new literatures in English. Because when you teach African literature from the way I've been describing it, you would find that your students, your readers, would relate to African literature, and they begin to, from something that is familiar to them. Take, for instance, the attitude, the world, the Western world's attitude towards Africa. It is something. It's not something that would be strange to people in non-Western cultures because they have experienced, this. So my emphasis is what is working is working well. Unless you teach African literature from the point of view of a separate and autonomous subject, you will continue to carry on, teach it with those attitudes early Europeans came to Africa with. So I would urge you to please do a reorientation of the place of African literature in India. Don't teach it as just under an umbrella called new literatures in English. I would also, you have so many things that you can really, African literature is more than just a few names. It's more than Chinua Achebe, it's more than Wole Soyinka, it's more than James Ngugi wa Thiong'o, it's more than Dennis Brutus, it's more than, there are hundreds and hundreds of writers in Africa, in African writers. Bring what they have written into your schools, into your school system. Let students who are studying at the master's level, at the doctorate level, let them be conscious. Lead them to look at the diversity that's African literature. For instance, if you're teaching feminism in your classes, unless you look at some female writers from Africa, you would miss the point of explaining to your students that there's a difference between feminism as it is seen in the Western world and Black feminism. There are two writers that I want to bring into your attention in this respect. The Egyptian writer from her head, um, who is in fact one of the greatest feminist, African feminist writers of all time. Nawal El-Saadawi died in March this year, but I suspect that not many people recognize her impact in the field of feminism. When I sat down with Nawal El-Saadawi in her house, in her home in Cairo in 2018, and wanted to know why she is so unrelenting in her feminist defense of women, female rights and women rights, not just Arab women, but the world over. She gave me a chronological account of the critical events, critical side events that formed her life in writing. As far back as 1972, she had lost her job as a medical director in Egypt. A magazine, Health, which she founded and was editor-in-chief, was closed down by the government. In 1981, President Anwar Sadat put her in prison for views expressed in her writings. At various times, her name had figured on death lists issued by some fanatical and terrorist organizations. Several of her books were banned in Egypt. Sometimes the victimization went beyond the banning of her books. In 2001, she won her case in a Cairo court against forceful divorce from her husband, according to his law. In 1991, the Egyptian government closed down the Arab Women's Solidarity Association that she had founded and presided over, and its magazine Noon, which she edited. Nevertheless, they remained undeterred and undaunted. In 2004, she topped all her dissident positions by presenting herself in the Egyptian election as a candidate for the office of president. You cannot teach feminism anywhere in the world today without giving solid attention to Nawal El-Saadawi. And if you haven't read any of her many books, 40 books and more, read at least her Woman at Point Zero, and you get what I mean by her defense of women's rights. A younger writer than Nawal El-Saadawi, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie in Nigeria, is also a strong name in terms of feminism. Read her Purple Hibiscus, read her Half of a Yellow Sun, read her Americana, and read her non-fictional writings, such as We Should All Be Feminists. I'm pointing out these two. There are many other African women writers. So please, there is a lot in the field of African literature that suits. There are a lot that many readers and scholars would relate to. If you're looking for if you're looking for theories of literature, if you're looking for feminism, and so on and so forth. Finally, how do we make this collaboration? What's the way forward? I had indicated that as early as 1988, Dr. C.D. Nayasmaya and I had edited a book called African Literature Terms of Age. So, and I've also thanked the organizer of this seminar, for again moving forward this connection, the Indian-Nigerian connection. There are some practical things now that we have to do. I have suggested that in India, in West Bengal, where there are hundreds and hundreds of universities, begin teaching African literature, not as a unit of new literatures in English, but as a full-fledged, autonomous, separate subject in the curriculum. African literature has a lot that students at the level of, at master's level, at PhD, doctorate level, can research into. There should also be, teach comparative literature. If you don't have anywhere else to put African literature in the curriculum, teach comparative literature and use African literature there. And also organize more conferences, international conferences, and explore these connections. There are rich sources that point to the connection, the connections, the relationships between India and Africa, India and Nigeria. And Indian films, Indian chapbooks played significant roles in the development of a segment of African literature. They should be explored. On the Nigerian side, I must publicly congratulate Professor Apanya and his team at the University of Nigeria and Nsukka for what they are doing. Thank you, Professor Apanya. Your students are being inspired, have seen what they have done with the muse, but please also remember that that's not the only legacy that Chinua Achebe left. Think about Okike, an international journal that had reached really an apex. Do your best to please revive it. So exchange programs, exchange professorships, and exchange faculties, international conferences. Hopefully, it won't be long before African Literature Association will be held in Nigeria. But do your best to develop this collaboration that started with the initiative of Haridas in 1988. 4 decades later, we are still talking about when will this move forward. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. And I do hope that when the pandemic is all over, we will have conferences face-to-face in Nigeria and also in India. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Since this was a recorded session, as it were, and unfortunately, Sir could not sort of attend it, so I would request my colleague, Professor Debanjan Shet, to just say a few words before I move on to the next thing.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible. You're audible, Debanjan. Please continue.
Okay. Yeah, our heartiest thanks goes to Professor Emenyonu for taking the trouble of delivering this lecture for this occasion, specifically for this seminar, even in such a fragile condition. Well, he has rightly differentiated between a claimed origin of African literature and a genuine origin of African literature. The claimed origin, of course, carried the baggage of biases and prejudices that make the African literature merely an appendage, as he said, merely an appendage to European literature, which is why one must look for the roots of African literature that lie in the impressive oral tradition that includes the oral performances as well. So he emphasizes the fact that storytelling, which is at the heart of all literature, did not begin in African literature from the middle of the 20th century with the arrival of Things Fall Apart, which is, of course, something that changed the world literature forever, because this is where the oral and the written, the traditional and the modern were amalgamated. From there, he went on to Achebe's famous comment on language expansion, or extending the frontiers of the English language and using it creatively so as to accommodate the African thought patterns. She also focused on how literature and history dovetailed into each other in Achebe's novels. From the pre-colonial Africa in Things Fall Apart, to the independent Africa in No Longer at Ease, to the military dictatorship in The Anthills of Savannah. And his final appeal to us, the academic fraternity, is a reorientation of African literature. He urges us not to teach African literature as a part of the new literatures in English, but as a separate and autonomous part of the curriculum, which must include the evolution of African literature from oral performances to its flowering in the European languages. I believe that Professor Emenyonu has driven home this point well enough to ring in our minds the next time we enter a class on African literature. And of course, as the professor rightly emphasized on the India-Nigeria connections, I'm sure that such connections are being explored as we speak. And this seminar, among many others, is definitely a big step forward in that direction. And big thanks to him, and a big thanks to our organizers, and of course to our participants who have bore with us through these technological issues. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Debanjan. Thank you, Debanjan. Thank you very much. So the whole summing up of the session would be done by Dr. Chandrani Biswas. I would request ma'am to kindly sum up the lecture, because she is the one who, at least in the case of mine, she was the one who initiated me to African literature in those very large colonial classrooms of University of Calcutta. So I would request ma'am to kindly sum up the session in very briefly. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Nilanjan. And I think Professor Seth has very well summarized the whole lecture. It's wonderful. And good morning, everyone. Good morning, Dr. Orpita Mondol, Dr. Kalapi Sen, and everyone, all dignitaries present. My dear students, Nilanjan Chakraborty and Sharanya Sen. In spite of it being a video presentation, I think it is a very invigorating, a very intellectually stimulating, and a wonderfully enriching talk by Professor Ernest Emenyonu, Professor Emeritus of Africana Studies, University of Michigan. And I once again take the opportunity of congratulating the organizing team members of the Department of English and the Department of Bengali, Panchla Mahavidyalaya, in association with IQAC Puras, Kanpur, Haridas, Nandi Mahavidyalaya. Now, Professor Emenyonu has already talked about the Western world's attitude towards Africa, the Eurocentric dismissal of a rich legacy of oral literatures, the relationship between orators, the very act of storytelling and narrative perspective, the distinctive and tangible relationship between African literature and socio-political conditions, the emergence of written literature in the post-colonial context with a medley of illustrative instances such as Chinua Achebe's path-breaking book Things Fall Apart, together with, giving instances from Nadal Sadawi and also Dennis Brutus, whom he referred to, and many, many more, as he rightly said. He also insisted upon the idea that African literature ought to be treated as an autonomous domain of reading and research. It should not be put under the broad umbrella of new literatures. It has a different claim altogether. And he also inquired into the degree of the Indian reader's acquaintance with African literature, the researchers, Indian teachers' acquaintance, and though he is not present here with us, I can assure you, sir, that now we have really taken strides, and African literature is very much part of the rich content of the syllabi in most universities and the institutions. And so we teach a lot of African texts, like Things Fall Apart, An Arrow of God, and Destination Biafra, and of course, Efuru, Edu, so many, especially under the CBCS syllabus. And we have included, I said yesterday, also mentioned that in the PG courses in different universities. And he very rightly proposed a literary and cultural collaboration between the Indian and Nigerian universities and institutions, and he praised your efforts so much. So once again, extending very warm wishes that you have taken a step, and this is so very beautiful. This is great. This is wonderful. So this should continue. You are setting examples. He also talked about the relevance of feminism in the context in which many texts ought to be taught. So the relation between text and context. And we know that it is through post-colonial writings the women writers have fought their gendered battle in, subverting the masculinist appropriations and the engagements with native cultures. Using methods of resistance, women writers were attempting to portray a realistic picture of double colonization that women experienced in a very colonized society. So I feel that even with the technological mass cultural forms like cinema, television, radio, advertisements, and internet, African literature will continue, and literature as such will continue to leave a lasting impact on academia and beyond that. So thank you very much. It has been really, really a great privilege to be part of the session. Thank you, everyone, and the organizers particularly.
Thank you very much, madam, for that wonderful summing up of this seminar. And I don't think we, in India at least, we could have got a better person than you to sort of comment on Professor Ernest Emenyonu.
There are. I must just 1 second. I must recall and pay my homage to my guru, who introduced me to African literature and who really initiated and helped me to really go beyond the veil, because the kind of images I had in mind about African literature, and Africa is the savanna grasslands and people wearing colorful headgears, and also the apartheid movement, nothing beyond that. So my pranam to Professor Dr. Harish Narang, who introduced me to African literature in the Center for Linguistics and Cultural Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University, under whom I did my dissertation. And he was the one who initiated me to Antilles of Savannah and Buchiamacheta, and way back. Okay, so I think we have really many African scholars, so Kolapi is also, an African scholar in her own right. And so we have a lot of new Africanists coming up. And even the Department of English and Comparative Literature in Jadavpur University and Calcutta University, we have Dr. Krishna Sen. She is my mentor in many ways. We have Dr. Ipshita Chando. So many of them. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, madam. Thank you so much. So with that, we close this session. Thank you again, Professor Kalapi Sen, for everything, because not just for entering this session, but getting in touch with all the African professors Emenyonu and the others. In fact, all the African speakers that we have got in this seminar was because Professor Sen could he got us in touch with them. Thank you, Professor Sen, so much. Thank
you, Nilanjan. Yes, Nilanjan. Thank you very much for the so many, a plethora of good words. Thank you very much for that. I am really thankful to the college and your departments who have organized and have actually concentrated on African literature, which is still in the margins. And as Chandranidhi was saying that, yes, of course, she being a very senior teacher, and of course, I address her as Chandranidhi, but had I been in Calcutta University,
she would have been my student.
Definitely, she would have been introducing me to African literature and all. Major problem Chandrani might be remembering in the India teaching African literature in the Indian classrooms is the interpretation. Way back in 2005-06, when I was doing my master's, my post-graduation studies in Rabindra Bharati University, there was this It was in the optional paper, of course, New Literatures in English. However, it was made mandatory, and we had no option other than choosing the optional paper of New Literatures in English. So we were introduced to African writers, of course, and No Longer at Ease was one text. And this was one thing that I had pointed out, Chandranidhi will be remembering in the last year's webinar, where I had pointed when we teach, see, we people like Chandranidhi, myself, we are fortunate enough to have had a background study of what African literature is, and then we come to teach African literature to right. But what happens, when texts, especially a text like No Longer at Ease is taught, I'm sure many over here, many listening to me live on Facebook will be actually agreeing on the fact that it is reduced to a mere text. No Longer at Ease is also presently a text at the PG level in many universities right now. The problem I feel in the way the syllabus pattern is set. We definitely recommend background readings, but as a student, I don't know, I did not do much background reading and was dependent on the teachers. And recently in a conference, in a special lecture, I don't know which, I don't remember actually which college, but there was a person, I'm sure he was not from the background of African literature, but of course there is no copyright to speak on Chinua Achebe. You have to be an African scholar or something. But when we are speaking, when we are teaching in colleges, in universities, I think definitely people like Chandranidhi do it. I know, I'm sure of that. But I think we should have our facts clear, because I wanted to point out one thing. That is, in that conference, in that special lecture, I heard this honorable professor talking or introducing Igbo just as a language and Igbo as just one tribe in Nigeria. This is what happens, and this is what, to quote Adichie, danger of a single story. Isn't it, Chandranidhi? Of course, when we are teaching, of course, when I am teaching Chaucer, I don't have to be an expert in Chaucer, but I need to have my facts clear. Right.
No, actually, as you very rightly point out, Kolapi, the entire mass of the socio-political, cultural configurations do not somewhere figure if you teach a text per se. I mean, I don't think we can really apply the death of the author, trope to a reading of an African text, because the cultural legacy really comes down, and it influences so much of the storytelling. Very much like our Takuma Julie and the innumerable fairy tale traditions come into the teaching of many Indian texts. In the same way, you cannot teach the text per se. As I think Sharon also pointed out about the problem of the differences between the Euro-American tradition of reading and a presentation of the hero and the protagonist, and the way in which they happen, because it's the community which is very much at the center.
Right. Yes, are very that is what, like, precisely. Yeah. But of course, don't you think just calling
Kalapidi, can I just interject over here? I know we are really enjoying this conversation, but the problem is that we have a technical session coming up at 12:30. So I'm very sorry that I had to sort of interject over there. I apologize for that. So let's end this session over here, because we all have to rush to those paper presentations.
Sure. Yes, but just a minute, Nilanjan. Yes. I just want to thank my personal thanks, my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Chandrani Vishwas and Dr. Kalapi Sen for being with us today. We are really, really lucky to have you with us, and hope to meet you someday, to have you in our college someday when the earth heals. So until then, please take care of yourself and stay safe, everybody. Thank you so much for being here.
So thank you. And this is a notice to the paper presenters. Please join your respective sessions right now, so that we are going to enter over there. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Nilanjan. Thank you very, very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.